Good evening. Tonight, Voices is a little different because there are only two of us, Susan Santag and myself, John Berger. Susan and I have quite a lot of things in common, I think. We both write essays about literature, about ideas. We both have worked for films. Susan has just come back from Rome, where she's been making a film based on one of her own short stories. I've written film scenarios. We've both, from time to time, written quite a lot about photography, about the visual photographic image. And then finally, and perhaps most important of all for tonight, we both write fiction, novels and short stories. And tonight, we are going to exchange views and experiences about this activity, somewhat mysterious really, this activity of telling stories. If I think of somebody telling a story, I see a group of people huddled together, and around them a vast space, quite frightening. Maybe they are huddled against a wall, maybe they're around a fire. And somewhere for me, in the very idea of the story, there is something to do with shelter. The shelter, perhaps, of the voyager, the traveler who has come home, who has lived to tell the story. Or the soldier who has come back, who has survived. So there is this almost physical sense of shelter, where the story represents a kind of habitation, a kind of home. But then, inside the story, there's another kind of shelter. Because what the story narrates and tells is sheltered within the story from oblivion, forgetfulness, and daily indifference.
But you're talking about stories in a very remote kind of society that's quite different from ours, because surely storytelling is much more diversified in the societies that we know. Parents tell stories to children. Children ask for stories. We experience stories mediated through images, as in television and movies. We read stories in print. I think that the most archaic definition of storytelling, it does tell us something about, we imagine where storytelling comes from, but it doesn't tell us very much about what stories have become, I think, or what the challenge of storytelling is now.
Yes, I agree. But I'm not certain that something of that primitive origin doesn't remain. For instance, when children hear stories, or when we were children, and they told us stories, when does it happen? In bed, in this strange no man's land between waking and sleep. And in that telling of a story, or listening to a story, there is something reassuring. And very curious, because the more exciting, the more threatening the story, the more reassuring it is. Why?
But John, don't you think that people make a distinction between a story that is true and a story that is imagined or invented? I'm always struck by the fact that there's a kind of ambiguity in the very notion of storytelling. On the one hand, we think of storytelling as a truth-telling activity. Tell me the real story. Mm-hmm. We think of stories as bringing information. We think of stories as revealing secrets. Stories, true stories that might be told after someone's death, because, for instance, the death of someone is generally an occasion for telling stories about a person's life, and maybe some truth comes out that wasn't discussed or generally shared before that person was gone. But we also think of stories as, that's only a story, or don't tell me stories, meaning don't tell me lies. And don't you think at the very center of the whole enterprise of storytelling, there is the fact that storytelling is an activity that faces in two directions. On the one hand, it's connected with an idea of truth. On the other hand, it's connected with an idea of invention, imagination, lies. One is thrilled by the story precisely because it describes something that can't happen. It's connected with fantasy. I think it's also so complicated, and the model of the voyager or the returning soldier who is telling what really happened, who is bringing exotic news and telling terrible stories generally, is only one model of storytelling.
Yes, yes. I don't want to insist too much upon that. And probably those stories were very embroidered. Yes, the story exists somewhere between fiction and truth. I agree. If I think now, straight away, of my own personal experience in telling stories or writing stories, I think they begin off, for me, and they have to begin off, as truth. For instance, I won't tell you the whole story, but
yes,
a little one. A man I knew in the village where I live, a shepherd with about 100 sheep. And he fell in love. Fell in love with a woman, married, not from the village, from the town. A long love affair, well, for a couple of years, very passionate, probably with the complicity of the husband. And the woman, well, he gave her many things. Half of what he had, at least, including a house. And then she turned him out. And he decided to die. He didn't kill himself. He went on a kind of hunger strike. And then he died. When I think of him now, I can see his face, his very large hands, his eyes. That was truth. Then I tried to write that story.
And then you started inventing.
I started inventing, but in relation to the truth. But, if it worked, I don't know, this story will be read as fiction. And it will be read as fiction about a story of more or less unrequited love. And why will it be fiction? Because it will exist both everywhere and nowhere. And it is that displacement of place and time which makes something fiction, it seems to me.
But why would it be read as taking place everywhere and nowhere? Don't you situate it in the village where you live?
For me, it's situated in the village. But as soon as one reads a story, when we read other people's stories, we have an idea of that place, but it becomes part of our experience and therefore is displaced from where it really took place. I mean, it seems to me that fiction is something which exists, which goes beyond its immediate time or its immediate place. And it's exactly that which makes it fiction, or what we call fiction.
I don't have that experience, I think. Well, of course it's true that I'm not where the story is taking place, but if you're talking about some kind of traditional storytelling which is grounded in a particular place, if I read a story of Tolstoy,
Yes.
I think I'm in 19th century or early 20th century Russia. I don't think it's taking place everywhere.
But it applies to you and your experience of life.
Not necessarily. No, it might instruct my experience rather than apply to it. I mean, I'm not looking to see myself projected in stories any more than I'm trying to express myself when I write stories. No, I don't think stories are necessarily universal because they're read by very different kinds of people. Some stories, because the most powerful form of storytelling is very compact, and if it's very compact, it's likely to be very economical in its details, and therefore this economy can be experienced by us with our modern ways of looking at things as something abstract. And in that sense, it may take on a certain universality. But I think it is the particularity of storytelling and the fact that we now have available to us stories from every part of the world that fascinates us. And I don't ask that the story address my experience. I ask that my experience, so to speak, make it possible for me to understand the story.
Yes.
I'm not looking for myself in the story. I think I have maybe another way of looking at it from you, because I really start not from the oral tradition, but from the literary tradition. If I think of storytelling, let's say the parent to the child now usually in our society is reading a story rather than telling a story. We have so many stories available to us. In fact, sometimes people say that we have a surfeit of stories, which is why storytelling is often thought to be in a state of crisis. And so my model is originally a literary model, and I'm a city dweller. And you're someone who has lived a large part of your life, though you grew up, as I understand, in London, in a peasant community in the south of France. And therefore you feel closer by choice, because you've chosen to live there, to another, what many people would think of as an older form of storytelling, which is oral. And you have the stories of these people's lives whom you come to know. And you want to tell their stories to other people, because there's, I think, an ethical assumption behind your work that there are stories which have not been told, certain kinds of people and certain kinds of experience which have not found voice. And you want to give voice to, or experiences which are neglected, or regenerate or revive certain forms of storytelling which are neglected now in favor of perhaps more sophisticated, city-oriented, print-oriented kind of storytelling. I mean, isn't that what you're saying? When you told this fascinating story about the shepherd and his unrequited love and his kind of suicide, the reason you wanted to tell this story is that you were moved by him, and he was a kind of person that perhaps you don't find in our literature as much anymore, although obviously there are. I mean, one only has to go back to Hardy, if not to other examples, to find stories of that kind, but perhaps they're not told today as often. And so don't you feel that some stories should be told rather than other stories? Isn't that behind your attitude towards storytelling?
I think it's less, perhaps it's less sociological than that. It doesn't really concern me whether that kind of story exists in literature or not. If I'm very, very honest, I mean, it is because that life was lived, I see a kind of meaning in it, and I would like to retain it, mm-hmm. so that it is not lost, not forgotten. Mm-hmm. I mean, whether we're telling stories in a city context or in a village, probably you'll agree that, in fact, stories begin at their end. I mean, in life. Mm-hmm. I mean, the story of Romeo and Juliet, in a sense, begins at their death. That is when the story is given form. The end is not always death, but it quite frequently is.
That's a point, I think, that's worth talking about, why death seems the natural end of a story, and in the most traditional form of storytelling, I think that it is. Is it because a death is the natural end of a life, and what stories are about are lives? See, I think they're about much more than that, and but that is certainly one model of storytelling, to tell the story of a life, to give the value of a life in the form of a story which has its natural end as a death. But if I think, for instance, of the first stories that I remember reading which really marked me as a person, and undoubtedly as a writer too, were the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. Mm-hmm. And those are not stories of a life, but they are real stories, absolutely unforgettable stories. They are stories generally of a disaster which may or may not end in death. It often does, but they are terrifying stories. They are fabulous stories, and on the whole, they are invented stories. And the storyteller is the person who invents. We have examples of that now in writers like Calvino and Borges, who certainly think of themselves as storytellers, but they're not telling stories of lives. They're telling stories of dilemmas, let's say, which often are catastrophes. What about that kind of storytelling, as opposed to rendering a life? It's quite another model, and it's one that interests me very much.
I think that the fantastic story, what does it tell us? I mean, you tell me. What is our need for the fantastic story? We have it. I agree with you. I agree with you. But why?
Well, I think people want to travel outside themselves. I think there's a need for vicarious experience that is not necessarily identical with the need for truth. I think there's a need for fantasy. I think there is a longing to see taboos broken, violated. There is well, the imagination runs riot. And I think that kind of storytelling is very important. I must say it does appeal more to me. I always feel when I'm writing stories that, well, I'm inventing, and I might use something from my own life or the life of someone I know, but I feel as if I'm lending that to something that is basically invented and that therefore basically fantastic. And I think of fiction, but again, I'm just speaking for myself and thinking of examples of fiction that I like very much. I think of fiction as a kind of speculativeness, a kind of fantasy. I'm interested in moral fantasies, moral science fiction even. And this could have the form of some kind of history or actually be placed in the past as well as in the future or in the present.
If we take the experience of writing a story or of listening to one, the story, it seems to me every story has its own subjectivity. And I emphasize that because I think this subjectivity is an area where what you call the truthful and the fantastic actually coexist, because it is a subjectivity.
Do you mean a voice?
Well, a voice in a minute, Susan. We must talk about that. But no, I mean a kind of subjectivity. Now, and it seems to me this subjectivity is a kind of amalgam of three elements or three people. The storyteller or the writer, the protagonists of the story and their subjectivity, and then lastly, the subjectivity of the listener. And the story, there is already a kind of cooperation between these three, which actually makes the subjectivity of that story.
It's very strange to me what you're saying, because I can't feel the subjectivity of the listener or the reader. To me, that is, of course, I think if I write a story, it will be read. I wouldn't write if I didn't think that I could be read. But I can't imagine how that could actually be part of the story.
When you were a child, remember listening to stories? And who were you? You were yourself, you were the person telling you the story, and you were the characters, all mixed together in a rather reassuring way.
Maybe that's because I think the difference between hearing stories and reading them is greater than you do. We have to stop now, and we'll be back in a moment.